Hey, all, welcome in. This is the CoderPad live stream, and we're here to chat with James Quick about serverless content creation, JAMstack, all sorts of good stuff. James, welcome in.
What's up? How's it going?
Going well. How about you?
Doing good. I've got one of my lights is not working, so I've got the like half shadow thing on my face.
The two-faced scenario here. Wait. We can make it even better.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Like just one of the lights didn't connect it to Wi-Fi or something. I don't know what's going on.
And sometimes it's just like that, you know.
I've already had audio issues. I don't usually. I mean, I do this stuff so often. I usually don't have to worry. Like I just click a button and everything's ready to go. And now things are messing up, but it should be okay.
What is the name of that rule where it's like whenever you least expect something to go wrong, everything goes wrong?
Yeah,
I forget the name of it.
If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. Yeah, something. Yep. That's especially given either live streams or like when I remember giving talks in person back in the day, which I'll have an upcoming couple of conferences in the next couple of months. So I'm excited to be like in person for a conference again.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
I think that the last conference I went to wasn't even a conference. It was like some meetup with like 4 people. So like I'm ready to socialize with people again.
To see a lot more people. Yeah.
Yeah. There's just like a different kind of vibe in you know, like conferences, you know, being able to like walk down the halls and be like, oh hey, I know that person, you know, like
Yep.
different experience.
Yeah.
What conferences are you going to?
One in London in April, which is fun. It's actually 2 technically back to back. It's International JavaScript Conference and DevOps Conference. So I'll be talking at both of those, and my wife and I are going to make like a whole thing out of it and go to Paris beforehand for a few days, and then be in London for a few days for the conference, and then Remix Con is in Salt Lake City.
Oh yeah,
in May, and then Render ATL is in Atlanta the first week of June.
Nice. What an all-star lineup. like,
It'll be
all the dream
a lot of
comps.
fun. Yeah. These are I'm really excited. I was super I had super FOMO last year during Render ATL. They did it in September or something, and like everybody on Twitter was just like blowing up about it, and I was so sad that I wasn't there. So glad to make it this time around.
And James Perkins is over here saying that he's going to try to be at a Render and Remix too. Man, I feel like I'm missing out.
Who, James Perkins is saying that?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, then there'll have to be a small little shindig or something like that.
I think there will be lots of parties.
Oh man, after so long, it's only makes sense, right?
So. Yep. That's like, I don't know. I feel like it's only going to get like bigger and bigger the longer we are not with in-person conferences and getting back to them. And I also just realized, which is why I was a little distracted, I was looking at, I guess, your personal Twitch channel, and I was like, it doesn't look like we're live. And then I realized I was looking at the wrong one. So it's the CoderPad one. So now I'm in Twitch.
Yeah. Very cool. Good. Man, so conferences, right? That's where'd you start with conferences? Because I always I had such a hard time breaking into my first conferences, and it was kind of like I ended up like just getting into one because I happened to know like the organizer or whatever, right? How did you get started with like giving talks at conferences? Like, you know.
Yeah. Knowing organizers is super helpful regardless. So I'd say that's pretty common. But I like my career started as a technical evangelist at Microsoft. It wasn't something I knew anything about. I just kind of lucked into an interview, to be honest. Or like, actually, I try to change the way I talk about stuff. So it wasn't lucky. It was not something I was looking for specifically, but ended up at. And so I started my career doing that. And at like 22 years old, I was given talks, like having never done public speaking before, but giving talks to people that had been writing code for 20 years, like longer than I had been alive. So it was like kind of a just get thrown into the fire type thing. And that was just like after the first 6 months or whatever, like I was pretty comfortable doing that. And then that continued to be a part of that job. And then when I left and did software development at FedEx, I realized I missed doing the conference stuff and creating content. So I started getting back into YouTube, paying my way mostly to go and speak at a handful of conferences the year that I ended up, or like the months leading up to me leaving FedEx, and then was back in developer advocacy at Auth0, and then now doing it at Planet Scale. So it's been like the majority of my career has been like talks being a big part of my responsibilities.
Right, right. So, well, like around that time that you were like joining Microsoft, were you originally looking for like developer positions? Like, how long had you been programming at that point?
Yeah, I was in college, so it was like I was graduating, so it was my senior year, and I didn't know anything, honestly. Like I'm so much more like motivational about taking control of your career and like figuring out what you want to do and go making that thing happen. Like at the time, I had none of that. Like I went to career fairs and everybody was talking about software engineering roles, and that's the only thing you're probably going to hear about, whether you go to boot camp or college, because those are the most common examples. And I actually applied for software engineer at Microsoft, and I got turned down. They thought I
Mm,
was a good enough candidate to interview for a different role, so I just wasn't a great fit for the software engineer. And so I went to DC and had final interviews for a TAM role, a technical account manager, which I also didn't get. They awkwardly, like, it was a bunch of people that interviewed. So they awkwardly sent everybody that didn't get the job back to the hotel in a limo, like really weird. And because it's supposed to be cool, but it's
congrats.
like, I know a bunch of sad people like
Oh,
being sad in a limo.
yeah.
Anyway, so then lastly, they were like, we still think like you'd be a good fit for Microsoft. What do you think about the technical evangelist role? I was like, I've never heard of that. That sounds made up. And that's how I started my career at Microsoft.
I swear that's exactly the same reaction I had because like so I was doing like blogging and trying to start Twitch streaming and whatever else, right? And then all of a sudden I was talking with someone like a mutual of mine and he was like, "Oh, you should try doing
Hmm.
developer evangelism or something like that." And I was like,
Do that
"What is
for
that?" And
your
he was
job.
like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, do that for your." And I was like, "Stop yanking my leg. Like that's not a thing."
Yeah. Yeah. It's most people like you just wouldn't, especially at the time, like you wouldn't have known about it at all. And it's becoming more and more common, but I also think it's more and more common to see if you're already in the community and especially on Twitter, like seeing people talk about creating blog posts and doing live streams and stuff. But the
Mhm.
reality is like 95% of just like developers are not doing this sort of stuff. They're not going to meetups, they're not creating content themselves, they're not consuming a whole lot of content themselves. A lot of developers just kind of go do their job and they're done, which is fine. But I think it like
Right.
we don't have a lot of people don't know that these types of roles exist.
Yeah.
So it is cool to see it like talked about more and like dev role content, interviews and stuff like this more. But yeah, it's a different thing that's growing, but it's still not like it's not the traditional role that people think of if you study programming or computer science or whatever.
Right. I remember like so I worked for Hilton for a while and I remember like some of the best engineers that I knew just had no interest in content
Hmm.
creation, right? Like I don't think that to require a good engineering or whatever requires content. But then on the other hand, like content is its own skill, right? Like there's people that I know that have not been engineering for as long as other engineers that I'm familiar with, and yet their content is just incredible.
Hmm.
Their ability to articulate and guide someone through an experience to be able to learn something by the end of it really is its own skill. And like, it's always really interesting when you can find someone who's both a very talented engineer and also very good at
Hmm.
conveying those ideas, such as you. You know, like it's awesome to be able to see that in the like in an environment and be able to just have a conversation. So
Yeah.
definitely very cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about like the stereotypical developer is like this is not true, but the stereotype is like the person
Right.
who's like in a cave all day, like doesn't want to talk to people and just stays by themselves. So it is like a unique skill set to combine like the technical knowledge and experience with the ability to one communicate and then also teach in the format of content. And I saw
Right.
like somebody posted on TikTok a video and they had like a really big following, but they were like very aggressive of like your social media presence is not going to get you a job in tech. And I'm
Mm,
like, and his point was like, you have to know your stuff to get a job, which like we can agree on that, right? Like no one's going to hire you if you don't actually know what you're talking about. But
right.
if you build a social media presence around content focused on the type of thing that you want to get hired for, it's like a hack. I mean, what
Yeah.
better way to prove that you know what you're talking about than to create a video or a blog post? Like there's the technical side that you've proven. Now you've got these additional skills on top of that that are going to be great for bringing people into your team, right? If they can communicate, they can communicate technical concepts to non-technical people. They can teach other people on the team to make everyone better. And
Right.
then like you never know when you need extra documentation or a video or something created. So I was like vehemently against the idea that social media like can't get you job, because it's just a story that gets played over and over again. Like somebody is learning and they share about their learning journey through, even if
Mhm.
it's just tweets or it's blog posts or videos or whatever. But those people that share are keeping themselves accountable. They're kind of giving proof to the world that they know what they're talking about. And then it's just that much more in a on a resume and then in an interview that they can talk about.
Right, right. And I think that like my personal experience has really reflected that as well. Like when I launched my blog, I wanted it to be this kind of like grandiose launch of like, oh, it's going to be this big cool thing. So I spent like 3 months writing like a 55 page like behemoth of like, we're going to read Angular source code and do all
Oh
this, and
wow.
like really went in depth. And I remember it was a few months after I had launched my blog, I went and interviewed for a lead Angular position, and I've never ever, I don't think I'll ever have this happen again, where I had an interview that lasted 30 minutes and that was the entire interview process
Hmm.
because I
Oh, the
shared the
entire
talk code.
process.
Yeah, the entire
Wow.
process was
Yeah.
one 30-minute technical screen call. And they
Yeah.
read my blog post in the call and they were like, okay, so next steps are we'll send you an offer. And that was like mind blowing to me, right? Like that's
Yeah.
fairy tale made up nonsense especially for a lead position, right?
But it's just,
Um,
I mean, it's just like I said, you see it over and over again. Like there's
right.
your resume is just words, right? Like
Mhm.
everybody has responsibilities at a job and has experience. It doesn't actually mean anything other than just being required to get a conversation. But if you
Right.
look at proof, like that's the kind of stuff that proves it, right? Like there's not really much way around that. You could kind of bullshit your way through a blog post or video, but it's not likely, and it's probably pretty obvious to people that are watching. So that's like it's not required at all, but if you want to hack to like get into the industry and or take your career to the next level, creating content is absolutely what I would recommend people do.
Oh yeah, and it doesn't even have to be like the. I joke about it being a behemoth launch of the blog, right?
Mhm,
But like, I mean, I've had other posts where it's like maybe 1,000 words, and that's enough
mhm.
to spark a conversation or articulate what I'm trying to demonstrate, right? So there's a lot of value in that shorter form content in a development team, right? Like being able to, as you were talking about, document those APIs or even have code comments that well explain what is happening in the code is such an undervalued skill, I think. We got someone in chat saying, note on content creation. I think the fact that the quality of the engineer and creator reflects the quality of the content is often overlooked and may even be a cause for the best engineers to not get into content creation at all due to preemptive frustration or whatever you can call it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, and I think more it's like not easily or not easy mentally, because the biggest
Yeah.
thing is like people are like, oh, I want to be DevRel. Like, what piece of advice do you have? And the first piece of advice is like just ship content. Like
Yeah.
it will be shitty the first however many times you do it and you'll just get better. But the biggest problem that people have is creating the first piece of content because they overthink, they try to make it perfect, they get nervous, they think it's already been
Mhm.
done. And so the best piece of advice I can give people is just create something and share it and then continue to do that on a consistent basis and get better as you do. Like you look
Right.
at any video early on and on my YouTube channel, it's drastically different than any of the stuff that I do now. And I went through like a series of writing a blog post every week for a blog called Scotch.io with a friend of mine, Chris. And like he would give feedback on every article because it was his platform. And so I got better at writing by writing 52 articles in a year, however much it was. And
Yeah.
the first ones weren't that good, right? Like it gets easier and easier the more you do it. So yeah, my ultimate piece of advice is like just start. No matter how nervous you are, just ship it and then get better the more you do it.
Right. Right. And I think that there's two things there, right? Like the first one is that it's a learned skill, right?
Hmm.
You are inherently going to get better at anything, right? Like I'm a huge Dark Souls fanatic now, right? But when I started playing the games, like I couldn't get past the first enemy. I
Hmm.
couldn't, like it's a dumb analogy, right? But it's with everything, right? Whether
Hmm.
it's learning a language and programming or linguistical language, right? Like whatever you're doing, you're going to intrinsically get better as you go on, right? But then I think the second thing that I've come to realize as I've gotten more into content creation is that like you know, some of my favorite YouTubers, for example, right, have super flashy edits, and like some of them have hand animated stuff that
Mhm.
sequences that last minutes long, and like really, really high production value. And it is okay to not start at that high level of value while you're starting, because the thing is that those people may have teams, they may have like folks that help review their content, right? Like there's usually more than one person behind major super high quality content, right? So there's nothing wrong with kind of scaling back and just starting with, let's do tutorial and let's make it something simple, camera off, you know,
Mhm.
whatever resources you have available to you.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch any of my videos, a lot of my friends in the YouTube space do a lot more editing than I do, and
Mhm.
the thing for me is it will be there's like law of diminishing returns. Like you look at a channel that has really
Yeah.
nice edits and stuff, and you're like, this is really nice. I am more likely to subscribe to that kind of stuff. But the thing for me is that takes potentially so much time that I wouldn't be able to keep the consistency that I have. So
Mhm.
I will sacrifice that level of polish for the level of consistency that I've maintained. And for me, that's the most important thing. And like you look at some of my biggest videos and they're not like I don't script stuff. I have like a couple of bullet points if I need to make sure I don't forget things, but other than that, like, I'm just going through and building stuff. It's nothing fancy, but I'm
Right.
consistent about it, and I create videos on topics that people care about.
And I think with technical content, that tends to be so important, is like, what are you talking about and what are you able to demonstrate and provide value for, right? More than edits or whatnot. Ben Myers is saying, I think it's better to explicitly start without the polish.
Mhm.
You'll figure out which way you like and whether you think it's worth investing or not. Yeah, totally. Also, Ben, to your point, one of my streams, even on this channel, not that long ago, I had the wrong audio setting ticks. So for the whole stream, I just and it was like, oh, I didn't notice until after the stream. Such a nightmare. So that's fun,
I
but
still
that stuff
have
happens.
yeah. I just published a TikTok video the other day that has just audio in one ear, going back to the conversation we had earlier, because I
Right.
forgot to hit the checkbox when I was recording in ScreenFlow. But yeah, that stuff
And
happens all the time.
and then you get the slew of comments where it's like,
Mhm.
you're one ear, one ear. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Which
oh,
is
I know.
almost it's almost better because like the
Right.
algorithm loves engagement. And so the more
It's
people
true.
comment on that sort of stuff, which there's also the joke that like if you want to know the right way to solve a problem, post the wrong way and people will go out of their way to tell you that you're wrong. Which still then only helps the algorithm to like get more promotion to the content. So
Yeah, they're some growth hacks.
yeah.
Speaking of TikTok, you've been, it seems like you've been more active on there lately. What drove you to like want to take a stab at it?
I think like having kind of a different side to my personality. Like I love creating content on YouTube, but I don't feel like I'm fully me. Like I feel like I have a lot more personality than shows in a tutorial where I'm like, go and do this and do this. Like
Right.
there's only so much personality I can have in that. So I just wanted an outlet, honestly, to be kind of funny and satirical. And I still feel like I'm like people don't quite know the real me through
Yeah.
TikTok, but at least they get like a different side of me that's not just like bland tutorial stuff. It's more like fun, entertaining,
Right.
satire stuff. And like I can kind of use that as a way to kind of spread my agenda in terms of like my opinions on like work-life balance and stuff. So I did a video
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
like someone asked me for help at 4 o'clock and I'm like, yeah, I'll help you sit down, we fix it. And then at 5:01, and I end my day at 5:01, they come back and they ask me for help and I just ignore them. Like I don't hear them and they're standing like right there and I just ignore. And like, all right, I'll just come back and ask you tomorrow. I'm like, okay. Cause I'm like, I'm setting that boundary for myself of like
Yeah.
my day ends at 5. Now, obviously there's exceptions, but like the stuff that I'm really passionate about, now I can kind of get more attention to it in a satirical, funny, entertaining way, and hopefully help encourage people to like work-life balance is important, take care of yourself, invest in yourself, learn, like all these things. So yeah, it's just been kind of a fun, different outlet for me outside
Mhm.
of the regular YouTube videos.
And that like work-life balance stuff is so refreshing to hear from someone in like developer relations, because I think that there's so much like just in the industry at large, right? There's so much of this hustle, hustle, hustle culture, you know, like, oh, if you want, you gotta be the best, or you know, whatever, right? And it's so frustrating because like I I understand why people, people want to better themselves and they're willing to work for it, and that's awesome. But there is always going to be a limit of needing to take care of yourself and
Mhm.
making that a priority, right? I remember early in my career, I used to do, I mean, double overtime without pay, without even anyone asking, because I just assumed it was the expectation, right? And you still get passed up on interviews, not interviews, but promotions. You still
Promotions,
get
yeah.
passed up on, because now it's an expectation, right?
Mhm.
So it's so refreshing to hear someone that has a following not be like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna game the algorithm by promoting hustle culture. Heck yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, that's like, I don't know. I almost feel like I have more motivational speaking in me than I've been doing. Like I've done a couple of talks about career and that sort of stuff, which touches a lot on work-life balance. But that's stuff
Right.
that I want to talk about more and more. And I kind of see a day where I'm like specifically giving talks, on that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's always been like number one for me is like I want to enjoy what I do first and foremost, but I
Hmm.
also have so many things that I enjoy doing outside of work that I'm not going to sacrifice that. Like I want to come
Yeah.
home, or I say come home. My wife and I both work from home, but I want to be done and I want my wife and I to go have dinner and play golf. And like we don't have kids yet, but just thinking about how much time kids take and how much opportunity there is to be a part of the things that they're doing or not is I really think a choice. And like some company cultures are much better than others. And I think you have to be intentional about
Much better.
finding the one that works for you. But at the end
Hmm.
of the day, like your boundaries are not, it's not up to other people to respect your boundaries. It's up to
Yes.
you to enforce them. And like a lot of
Yeah.
people don't do that and they don't think they have the capacity to. And some jobs they may not, which I think is just a sign that they need to find a new company and new culture to work in.
Well, and it's so challenging because, like, I remember again earlier in my career where, I'm getting paid pennies on what I'm getting paid now, right? Because I had to start somewhere, and that was the way I was able to break into the industry. And like, I remember not being able to look for those extra jobs,
Mhm.
right? And that's such a
Yeah.
frustrating, challenging experience. And it really can be like jumping into the deep end of the water when you're joining a new company, seeing whether that culture fit works. That's something that like I always try to encourage people is like when you're looking for work, there's always that level of like anxiety over like, okay, well, I need a job, I need a job.
Mhm.
But if you're in that position where you're able to, try to interview the company back, right?
Mhm.
Interviews are kind of a two-way street where like you should be asking questions about the company culture and getting a feel for it because, jumping ship may be more detrimental for your mental health if you're not cautious, which sucks. Like it sucks that it has to be that way, like it's not. I don't think either one of us is advocating for the fact of like, oh yeah, shitty companies are your fault and you should be, like, I don't think that's what we're trying to say, but there's a level of caution that we all have to approach, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, that's a big part of what I try to address with that conversation too, is like
Oh yeah.
the the advice is simple. Like if you're not happy, go
Hmm.
be happier, right? That's simple. But the reality is it's not that easy. Like just because
Right.
you decide I'm going to be happier doesn't mean tomorrow you're going to have a new job and a raise and a better title and better hours. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't happen that way. But the thing you can do, I think, is just make a decision for yourself that you're going to work towards something. Like if you know you're not happy at this job,
Hmm.
it's not necessarily gonna be easy, or if you know you want more money and you may not just get more money, but you can work towards that. So you can look at
Yeah.
like, what's the role that would get me more money, or what's the company that would get me more money, and what am I missing to get there? What skill sets do I not have? What do people have that are in that job at that company that I want? What's the average salary ranges at these different companies in these different areas? Like all that stuff is things that you can control on the path to making that change eventually. It may be 6 months, it may be a year, maybe 2 years, but if you ever my family, I feel like growing up all the time was just like they had jobs, but not careers, and they were limited by that,
Hmm.
and they had no other
Hmm.
choice. Like they just had whatever job they had without ever having a work towards something or like this is my goal, this is what I enjoy, this is what I do, what I want to do more of. They were just out of control of like their
Yeah.
career and the jobs that they had. So I think it's not easy, but you can make a decision for yourself that you're going to work towards making a change and do small things along the way to try to get there.
For sure. For sure. Uh, yeah. I personally like, I feel very, very fortunate to be in the position that I am because, going back to what you were talking about, like there's a lot of instances where I talk to other people and it's like, oh, I'm very lucky to be in this industry. And it's like, yes, that is inherently true. Like there's a heavy helping of privilege and opportunity that is kind of arose, right? But then there's also like the idea of like luck surface area of like, you know,
Mhm.
like there are steps you can take to increase the surface
Yeah.
area of like that dart hitting the wall. And there's a lot of people out there that are able to take those really small steps to your point to increase that surface area,
Mhm.
that I really admire, and have tried to emulate, as a result, you know, because, you know, you can see the success in other people, and, you know, it's very motivating in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, that's why I specifically called myself out for saying I was lucky to start my job as a developer evangelist at Microsoft
Right.
because, like, the reality is I applied for a job that I didn't get, but they liked me for the things that I brought to the table regardless. So because they
Right.
liked me, because they thought I'd be a good fit, they brought me to another role to interview for that I didn't get, but because they liked me, because they thought I'd be a good fit and I brought a lot to the table, they then brought up developer evangelist. So like,
Mhm.
yes, there's like the perspective of luck, but I feel like that takes away from appreciating the things that I had done along the way that they recognized and the things that I did well enough in the interviews that they recognized to get to that point. So I love the idea of like increasing that surface
Right.
span or surface area of luck. I think that's a good way to put it.
And I think that it's so important to have that conversation in the context of yourself, right? Because like we know our stories well enough that we can like convey our own experiences. But for other people, like I know so many of my friends that are so extremely talented, but then won't give themselves the credits for that talent, right? And it's like sometimes starting the conversation with yourself can help other people refocus the way that they think and approach their own like skill sets and whatnot, instead of like, oh well, I just got super lucky. It's like, no, you went to college for like 6 years, worked your butt off, and did three
Mhm.
jobs. Like, what are you talking about? You got lucky, you know, like you
Yeah,
know,
I think it's a common that like the self-deprecating thing,
yeah,
but I feel like it's just not beneficial for everyone
yeah,
involved, right? Like it's not,
yeah,
I don't know. So that's something that I particularly pay attention to for myself about how I talk about myself. And then also like if from a teaching perspective, anytime I hear my students downplay themselves, because ultimately what that means is you're going to downplay yourself in an interview and you're going to screw yourself out of a job because you didn't sell yourself.
right,
So there's like balance of cockiness and confidence, but you have to have confidence to like no one's gonna want to hire the person that's not confident in themselves. That just doesn't
yeah,
make
yeah,
sense. They're gonna wanna they're gonna want to hire the person that's confident they can do the job, that they're confident that they can learn a lot. They're confident they can progress in their career. Otherwise, like unless you just have nobody else to hire, like you want to hire the person that is optimistic about what they're doing.
for sure, for sure. You'd mentioned students. Is that like for some of the courses you've written, or like do you like?
Yeah, this is separate from that. So this is a boot camp that I taught 2 rounds of called Launch Code. So they're
Okay.
organization that started in St. Louis, and they did these boot camps in more and more cities across the U.S. And so they did the first one in Memphis that I was the lead instructor for in person, and then it was a virtual one that we did for Northwest Arkansas. So during COVID. So
Mhm.
it starts with like 160 students with like
Wow.
10 or 15 TAs. So it's a big group. And
Yeah,
that like by the end of it, it's like 60, 50 or 60 people that actually finish and graduate. And that's just kind of what they expect. But I mean, it's really like kind of life changing to be a part of that because there's like every day for a couple weeks or a month or whatever, it was like, okay, so and so just got hired, or so and so like had gotten hired and got a
right.
promotion. So it's really cool to think about like how many people out of that like pretty big number of candidates now like have completely changed their careers, and talking about like taking control of where you are and working towards something with small steps along the way. Like these are people who were doing this outside of full-time jobs. They were doing it outside of having family and kids. They were doing all this stuff to try to make some improvement in their life. And to see that happen over the course of 6 months to a year is pretty incredible.
And teaching is such a a unique experience, right? Like I've been programming for like 7 years now, right? And I guarantee you that if I step foot back in a boot camp and like go teach some students, I guarantee there's going to be an instance where someone's like, "Oh, hey, did you know you could do this?" It's like, "What do you mean about console.table?" That's a
Yeah.
thing. Like I remember I learned about that the first time, like years into my development experience, and just one of the students just brought it up as if it
Mhm.
was common knowledge, and that, well, oh, well, of course it exists. And it's always so cool to be able to see that dynamic of like, yes, there's a mentee mentor relationship, right? But then there's also that give and take. And I find this with pair programming as well, which is why I always love pair programming in any job that I'm in, of like learning from that experience and being able to see the other person's viewpoint,
Mhm.
and how it applies to engineering.
Yeah. Um, it's also you hear people's interpretations of things that you never thought about. Like I've always said, the best person to teach something is the person that just learned it because they
Mhm.
remember what it's like to not know that thing. Like I'll never know what it's like to be a brand new JavaScript developer. Like I'm a
Right.
teacher and I have empathy and I try, but I'll never remember it like it was yesterday, right? But the people who
Right.
just learned, they have more of a concept of the stumbling blocks that they had, the things that they didn't quite understand. And I think they're in a good position because of that to be able to articulate that to people that are learning.
And more than that, like I always find the best ideas for content come from listening to other people, right? Like you can get a good pulse on what like content there is or isn't, not
Mhm.
just through like numbers and SEO and whatever else, right? But honestly, some of the best ideas for content that I've heard has just been like, "Oh, hey, what is Node?" Right? Like I've had that question come up all the time. What is Node? What is NPM? And it's like, huh, I don't think anyone ever explained what those concepts were to me, right? Like you kind of just expect people to know it. Of course they know what Node is. It's mentioned in every tutorial, and then you go read three of them and they're like it's just
It's just jumping
jumps
in.
right in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I always think it's really interesting to be able to see that perspective, like you're saying, and like know what those limitations are in that early stage of learning that we just may have forgotten as we've grown in our development course.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, speaking of super harsh turn, so I apologize, but one of the things that I like took me ages and ages to learn about was like the difference between SQL and NoSQL. And I know that that is an area of expertise for you. Do you want to like give a yeah, if anyone has any specific questions, no, please, it's a great call out. If anyone has any specific questions, please feel free to ask at any point. But yeah, like what would be the differences between NoSQL and SQL, and like how do you like think about structuring a database?
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like push back on one thing you said. Like, I wouldn't consider
Oh yeah.
myself an expert at all, or like I wouldn't consider this an area of my expertise, and that's kind of why. Like before being at PlanetScale, starting in November, I knew very little about databases, like actual deeper knowledge than just doing tutorials and stuff. And so now it's a pretty cool opportunity for me because I get to learn a lot about like NoSQL versus SQL benefits, trade-offs, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's been one thing that I've done well at in my career, which I did the same thing at Auth0 where I didn't know anything about authentication. Like these are companies and products that now I get a reason to like build out these
Right.
supplementary or complementary skill sets and knowledge bases that are just beneficial, I think, in a career. So I wouldn't consider it an area of expertise, but it is something that, recently I pay a lot of attention to. So SQL, like relational databases, has been around for a long time. SQL being the most common language for interacting with them. Most of it's based off of relationships between tables. So if I'm a user, one of the things I'm actually working on for my Discord is upgrading the bot to use PlanetScale behind the scenes. And one of the
Nice.
things we're doing is adding a kudos command. So you can give kudos to someone else for the server is called Learn,
Mhm.
Build, Teach. So you can give kudos to someone for learning, for building, for teaching. And so you'll have like a user record, user table, and it'll have like profile information and maybe a total number of points that they have, like experience points. And then
Mhm.
you have a relationship with a table for kudos. So you track each of the kudos that was given. And that table has giver and receiver that has a relationship back to a user table. So it's a way like as your data scales, you don't put everything in one table. You're now breaking them out across tables and you can maintain these relationships between them with foreign keys and primary keys and that sort of stuff.
Right.
And There historically has been like some scalability limitations with that. That's one of the things that Planet Scale has kind of come out to solve, and there's other products that do the same thing. But it's kind of hard to scale that out horizontally, really big. So scaling vertically means if I have a machine that has 2 gigs of RAM and whatever else, I buy a bigger machine and I just run it on that. Scaling horizontally is now I distribute this stuff across as many machines as I want. And in theory, like it's just like how many resources do we actually have in the world in terms of scale? Like how many actual virtual servers or computers or stuff can I throw at this to spread my data and processing power across? Versus you can only make so powerful of one computer. So that's kind of the limitation of
Right.
scaling vertically. So
It's like
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, you can only have so many gigs of RAM.
Yeah.
Like the new Macs have like 128 or
Mhm.
something like that, and like
Yep.
that's absurd. But like that
Right.
much RAM is crazy,
Yep.
and yet super common in servers, especially if
Mhm.
you're hosting huge scales of data.
Yep. Yeah. So you hit that limitation there, and that's kind of where NoSQL I think was kind of the biggest thing is like how do we change the way we think about data to just go at a really high scale. And there's different types of NoSQL databases. Again, not an area I would consider myself an expert in, but you kind of lack that formal relationship between your data. And so the
Right.
common example is like, well, I want to create an app, but I don't exactly know what type of data I'm going to get. Or like, let's say I was working on a resume builder application for fun at one point. And so you'd enter in all this information and it would generate this PDF. So like storing the user's information, you could store all these different pieces of information, but a certain user may not have awards and things, right? So you may like have a field or a section to keep track of their awards to put on the resume, but some people may not have it. So like
Right.
you get in this thing with a relational database, if I need all these different columns for all the different properties I might want to track, even if not all of them have a value for that, they could be null or empty. And so those null or empty slots are basically just taking up space for no reason. They're not being used. So NoSQL kind of like you just add whatever you want and then don't waste space on the things that you don't need. So
Mhm.
traditional example being kind of a document based NoSQL thing. MongoDB is like that. You just throw up an object and say, "Hey, here's the object. It's kind of got whatever it wants or whatever I want it to have." So you're kind of saving on that space. And then there's some implications like at scale between distributing this. And I think the majority of that comes from like you're really just querying things based on like not primary key, but like a hashed key kind of thing, like a unique identifier for the record. And that's
Right.
hash, which makes lookup really fast, that kind of stuff. So NoSQL just kind of lack of formal structure, which leads into traditionally like bigger benefits in terms of scale. But there's things that Planet Scale does that let you keep the traditional relational database style or system or whatever, and still have pretty significant scale with that too.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Does PlanetScale support NoSQL as well, or is it just SQL?
Yeah, it does not. So it's built on top of MySQL. So it's specifically SQL,
Mm-hmm.
not NoSQL, not NoSQL.
Always fun wordplay, right?
Yep.
Uh, so one of the things that as I understand, and this may be if you were saying that you're not quite as familiar with like the huge scaling thing, because there's so much complexity there. There's like
hmm
multiple layers things there. But I know that one of the things that traditional like SQL databases helps a lot with is like processing large data. Is that in part because of like the lack of like a defined schema for like NoSQL? Like what in SQL kind of makes it more inherently useful for big data? And if that's not the case, then like what are the better use cases for SQL over NoSQL?
Some of that would depend. Like I think you'd have to drill into what processing of big data or large data sets would mean exactly. So you still like traditionally would have this limitation of not being as easy to scale horizontally instead of vertically. NoSQL just
Mhm.
um, more inherently being able to support that without some of the things like what Planet Scale and a few other options have to offer. I think like a couple things to think about is do I have a well-defined schema in my head that's not likely to change? If that's the case, then I get the
Right.
benefit of having these specific relationships defining them and having those rules. So now I know if someone's going to add data, that data has to follow these rules because we expect these different pieces of data to be there. If you're doing NoSQL, a beneficial reason for that might be like, I don't know exactly what my data is going to look like, or like, here's a bunch of things I might have, but not everyone's going to have all those things, or our schema or our idea of a schema or what properties and things we want to track may be evolving fast, right? Like those things may be changing, which if you're doing that a lot with regular relational database, you have to accommodate for that as you make your changes, right? Like if you
Mm.
change a column name, it's not that easy to just change the column name necessarily, depending on how your code is looking at it. So if you think about like schema
Right.
changes and code at the same time, if I make a schema change, my code has to be like right in line with that. Or there's this concept that I learned about recently, which is expand and shrink. So if you're renaming a column, you can copy all that data to a new column name, but leave the original one. That way you can ship the schema change, not have to change any of your existing code because it'll still work with the original one.
Right.
And then you can update that stuff as you want. And then when you feel like you finally got everything migrated over, now you can just drop that original column because all your stuff is migrated over. So
Like an
there's some like
incremental.
strategies around doing schema migrations and code to help with that.
Mhm.
In some ways, like you wouldn't have to worry about that with NoSQL. You just stop adding a property or whatever, right? I guess you'd have
Right.
to still go in and like write a
Clean
script
up.
or something to rename those properties. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, to be honest. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think having an idea of what your schema is going to look like, how often is it going to change? Do I have a bunch of potential options that I'm maybe not going to use all of them or not many of them much of the time? But to be honest, like when you start a application, the advice is like don't overthink it. Like just get started with
Sure.
what
Yeah.
makes sense. And if you actually hit some sort of scale, like Facebook, Twitter, whatever, like you should be making money to hire people to upgrade and make whatever changes you need to be able to
Right.
support it.
Right. I remember I've talked with some folks that are like, oh, I want to use like JRPC and add in like edge layer caching and I want to do this. And it's like, whoa,
Hmm.
we're talking about building a CRUD app. like,
Yeah.
and that's not necessarily bad if you're wanting to practice and learn those skills, right? But like if you're actually talking about building like a SaaS or something like
Hmm.
that, right? Like starting at that scale is actually in many ways detrimental because now you have to conform to all the limitations
Hmm.
of that scalability. So it's definitely interesting to have that cost benefit analysis almost.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, same thing with content. Just get started and ship stuff
Yeah.
and then iterate on it.
Right. Right. So you with Planet Scale, um, it helps solve some of the horizontal like scaling problems, right? I assume that there's then some API on top of MySQL that like Planet Scale helps to manage some of that.
Yeah. So Vitesse is kind of the underlying technology of PlanetScale. And this was used at Google to like support the scale of YouTube is like I think one of the most famous examples. So like the idea of can it support scale? Yeah, it can support like the scaliest of scale, the biggest scale in YouTube. Like I mean,
Right.
it's one of the biggest things in the world. So
It's
so
huge.
Vitesse is that like layer that orchestrates everything on top of MySQL. So it'll provision like additional clusters and it'll do replication, like all these really cool things that then enable really cool features in PlanetScale. So PlanetScale being like the customer base wrapper on top of what is underneath the hood. And so a few of those things, um, Vitesse supports like zero downtime schema migrations. And what that means
Oh wow.
is you can make a schema change and it's going to like basically create this ghost database and copy
Hmm.
over all your existing data or ghost table to this ghost table. While it's doing that, if you're continuing to write to the original table, it's going to continue to stream those changes over. So this thing is going to have not only like when you started the schema migration, all that data, but everything since as well. And then when that's done, now it's just going, you got two databases. Now it's just going to switch to say, this is your real database and this is the old one now. That's really, really wild. Like a lot of, like without that, you'd have to, do data dumps yourself and make copies. You'd have to stop your production applications for a few minutes if you do it well and make schema migrations and stuff. So
Hmm.
that's really, really cool. Another thing that is relevant for developers is the concept of branching. And so like we in our code bases, you have like GitHub is the most common centralized version control that people use. And you end up creating branches and you have pull requests and that sort of stuff to manage your development workflow. You have something similar inside of PlanetScale where you can create branches of your tables or of your database, which will copy over the schema for your tables. And then if you want to now like merge that back in, you can create a deploy request. So you have a main branch, most likely you can name it whatever you want, but it's a production branch and you can't write directly to it. Same reason that people don't often let people write directly to a master branch of code or main branch of code. And so
Right.
you create a branch, you make your changes, you test them, you go through CI/CD or whatever it is you do. Then you create a deploy request to actually like migrate those schema changes to your production branch. So it's a flow. Like from a DevOps perspective, you can actually tie into like scripts and stuff that run in your CI/CD process, which is pretty cool. But also just kind of like a methodology mentality that's similar to what developers are used to. So they have the ability to create these branches, safely test and make changes, make sure everything's right, and then merge it back in just like they would their code.
Yeah, that's super powerful because I know that like that type of stuff like it's one of those things where it's very easy to talk about in like a super quick format like this, but then to actually like make that a thing, it like
Hmm.
just from scratch is like
Yeah.
so challenging. Like people
Hmm.
throw money at that problem and still don't have it solved, you know?
Yeah.
So that's super.
Yeah. It's pretty unique, I think.
So when you write data using like Planet Scale, like say like I'm an application developer writing a backend that then communicates with the server, like do I just write as if it's a normal SQL backend or like how do I do the data writing process?
Yeah, it's pretty much MySQL. There's like one specific thing is we don't support foreign key constraints. Foreign keys are this ability to like have these relationships between like if I am a user record, I will have um, an address ID to a record in the address table, which is my address. So it'll be the primary key in the address table. It'll be the foreign key in the user table to relate to the primary key in the address table. So foreign keys exist, foreign key constraints do not, and that was a decision that helps enable some of the scale that we talked about earlier. What
Right.
that means, those constraints are like if I were to delete a record that has a reference to another record, constraints would kind of figure out, hey, I'm not going to let you do that until you delete all these other records that are referencing each other, so you don't have orphan records or like there's different ways you can handle it. But so we don't support foreign key constraints, which means we don't take care of that for you, which means it's your responsibility. If you delete a record over here that has a relationship with this one, you're going to have to go and delete that one too. So outside of that, it should be pretty much the same as a regular MySQL database, like how you connect to
Right.
your MySQL database, you'll create a connection string and put that in and connect and do kind of
Cool.
everything that you're used to. And we talk a lot about using Prisma as an ORM, object relational mapping. That's kind of an abstraction on the database. So you're not having to write like actual raw SQL statements. You have the ORM, which in this case, Prisma is for JavaScript and TypeScript. And you can just
Mhm.
like call functions like find many, find unique, that sort of thing. So it makes for a really easy way for specifically JavaScript developers to interact with lots of different types of databases, which includes PlanetScale through its support of working with MySQL.
Right, right. That's super cool. It's been really fascinating to watch Prisma grow over the past few years because I
Hmm.
remember when I started programming, it was like SQLize and like SQLize was
Hmm.
cool and all, but like it had its like really weird quirks of like, oh man, why is this ID accessed through like two sub properties or something weird, like
Hmm.
just some oddities. Although to be fair, some of that is probably because I was new to learning programming. So, um, but, it's been really cool to watch Prisma grow and like. I guess like I'd love to hear, especially for those that may not be more familiar with ORMs, how how does an ORM help you structure your data in code, and how does it make it like an easier to scale process in the long term?
Yeah. I don't know that it makes it easier to structure necessarily. It just makes it much easier to interact with. So like learning SQL, like the basics are fairly straightforward, right? You can do a select and a where clause and blah blah blah. But actually SQL gets very complicated depending on like what all you
Right.
need to do. And it can get complicated pretty quickly. But most importantly, it's really error prone. So if you're like typing in a SQL string and then passing that as a parameter to a query function or something. When I first started writing SQL for the very first time in an app that I was building in college, I was probably missing a semicolon or something was not capitalized and it gave me a terrible error and I had no idea what was wrong. And it was like days before I figured out that it
Right.
was just a syntax error, but like it's just a string. So like there's nothing there to tell you that there's something wrong. Now some tools are probably better than they were then. But anyway, writing like raw SQL stuff yourself is like time consuming. It's not fun. The format is not super easy. You don't get Intellisense with it. And it's just super error prone. So an RM is going to take all that away from you. Like basically, you're going to call a function that it provides to you, and then it's going to translate that to SQL behind the scenes so that you're not having to do it. And it like takes care of all the basic CRUD stuff that you would think of, like kind of right off the bat, usually. I mentioned with Prisma, there's like find unique and find many and create many, or maybe it's just
Right.
create many. I can't remember. There's delete, there's update or upsert or whatever. So they just have those as functions, and that's stuff that people are used to. So from a JavaScript developer perspective, I can just use JavaScript, do all the things that I would have needed to write raw SQL stuff for, which is just not fun. So it's just a lot easier to actually interact with your database. Prisma is really cool because it can do schema migrations as well. So you can,
Oh.
it tracks your schema in code as you create schema changes. You can run schema migrate, which will
Mhm.
apply those changes and kind of keep a record of what changed. So that's pretty nice as well. So in terms of like consistency and scalability of more people using it, you've got kind of a just a safer way, I think, for people to interact with their database.
Right. And one of the things that you'd mentioned is like IntelliSense, right? And like I remember there's a project that I have that has like a really type strict database layer, right? So I was writing like some queries to be able to access this data, and like
Hmm.
selectively picking out the things that I want so that I'm shipping the smallest amount down to the client, right? And I remember like there was an issue where it was like, oh, I missed a single thing. It's just because
Hmm.
it's a string. I had to include that one thing. No problem. But man, doing that with SQL would be like, all right, time to add a console log here and
Hmm.
console log dot here. And like, um, so it's one of those things that sounds really simple, but sometimes that developer experience can really go a long way in making sure that you're not hitting those errors when you wouldn't expect them.
Hmm. Yeah, Prisma has gone. I mean, it's just becoming like the de facto way in
Hmm.
everything that I see for people in JavaScript world to interact with databases. They even support, at least in beta right now, NoSQL with MongoDB. So the idea of like, oh, the other benefit of this, going back to this point or starting this point, is the ORM like takes care of the specifics between the different databases that you might want. So in theory, like I could use PlanetScale, not that I would do this, but I could switch out my database behind the scenes to something else and never change a line of my code because it's all like that's taken care of for me by the ORM. So I
Right.
guess it goes the other way too. If you have something else you want to switch to PlanetScale, then you could keep really all of your same existing stuff and just have that like swapped out behind the scenes with the environment variable for the database connection string.
Right, right. And that's like, I mean, people will spend ages doing refactors and
Mhm.
cleanup and whatnot. And like, especially if you are hitting that scale, trying to grow horizontally, moving to planet scale or something like that process of like, nope, it's just a new string and that's all we do. And we do our migration of our data and we're done. Like that's a huge, huge improvement over what it is if you're trying to write manual queries, right?
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Shoot. I realized that we've spent most of our time talking about really cool stuff. I've actually been like, we had a pre-prepared list of questions like revealing behind the scenes a little bit, and we've touched almost none of them, and yet I love the conversation that we've had so far. But simply so that our title isn't a lie, do you want to touch on serverless a little bit? Just like at least explain like really quickly like what serverless is.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So serverless does not mean there's no server. It means you as a developer don't have to worry about the server. It means you're not configuring servers, you're not spinning up servers, you're not starting and stopping and patching and updating servers. Like you just don't have anything to do with that, honestly. And
Right.
from a serverless function perspective, like right now or several years ago, if you were to build a full stack application in JavaScript world, you'd have to have like a full running node application. You have to deploy it to something like DigitalOcean or Heroku, etc. And then they came out with this idea of serverless functions, which is like most of these hosts abstracted enough away from you where you literally just have a function in your code and the host takes care of the rest. Netlify, Vercel, Cloudflare, these are all really great options for this, but they will basically run that function when an HTTP request comes in, and they'll kind of spin it up and then release it. So you're only using the resources that you actually need based on the usage. Because otherwise, if you had like a full node process, node server running, like that thing's going to be running all the time, regardless of if it's being used. So now you have like potentially savings costs, right? You have ease of development because you're not having to guess at how big of a server you want. You don't have to do any of that maintenance for a server. You just write code and it's hosted for you. And it just makes it so much easier to create, and cheaper, going back to both, to create applications as a developer. Like I can build complete full stack applications using serverless functions in one of those platforms, using serverless products. PlanetScale fits into that, and a bunch of others, Auth0 for authentication, and Cloudinary for images, and Twilio for text messages, like all these different SaaS products that are out there. I can just take advantage of the fact that they already work and they work really well and use them in my product to build my thing. Because most of the time it's not like auth is not going to be the thing that is the game changer for my app. Auth is something that I need to have for my app to be the thing that people are going to want to use.
Right.
So serverless, like a couple different aspects. One, serverless functions to create backend code, or code that runs kind of on a backend, but without you having to create, deploy, manage, update servers. And then also idea of serverless and JAMstack being there's all these different SaaS products that can take care of these specific things that you're probably going to need in your application. And now it's quicker to build. It's easier to build because you don't have to build it all from scratch. And then you can just have your product up and running quicker than it's ever like you ever have before. So it's never been easier, I think, with serverless, Jamstack, whatever of those you want to reference, to build an application, to feel like super empowered to build your own SaaS product. I've talked to and watched a lot of people on Twitter and Discord and stuff build their own SaaS products with serverless. And anyway, it's cool to see. It's cheap. Like none of the demos I've ever built have cost any money, which is nice. So if you just want to get started and see how it goes, and then like we mentioned earlier, if you get customers and people are signing up, it can scale with you.
Right. And so first of all, I have to say that that's like the best elevator pitch I've ever heard for serverless. Like that was like you covered every single point that I like have ever heard over the span of years of listening to conversations about this. So that was an awesome pitch. And I think like on top of that, like one of the things that I really appreciate about like serverless in particular is that like it allows you as a developer, like let's say that you're a solo indie developer, you maybe have one or two people that's working on a project. You don't then have to become a DevOps expert, right? Like, oh my God, I can't tell you how many times I've spun up PM2 and then just been like, what do you mean like process has like what do you mean inner proc, like SIGINT? What does any of that mean, right? Like I'm here to type console logs and like return status codes or whatever, right? Like, it can really help in terms of that like rapid incrementation and like especially with a lot of these SLA uptimes that these companies provide. It's a good way of setting up that initial scale, because as we were talking, just building stuff and getting it ready, it's a really great way to start rapidly prototyping and going off of a basis. So
yeah, never been a better time to be a developer.
Oh yeah. So anyways, I apologize for that rapid turn into serverless at the end. Figured I'd want to touch on it, and you absolutely nailed it. So
Cool.
but yeah, James, thank you so much for being here. This has been an absolute blast. And then y'all, thank you for being here, talking to the audience, of course. And yeah, we'll catch y'all next time.